To see everyone, good to be here, and we certainly wish a happy Father's Day to all those who are fathers, as has been mentioned. We just completed our second year of the missions emphasis week that is kind of it's Latin American missions, but really just missions in general, emphasis at Backwoods Christian Camp in Lineville, and we had a good week, very good week. Rained every day except for one, but I'm sure that was the case here as well. But and really, it wasn't too bad. It sounds bad when you say it that way, but it would rain and then the sun would come out. The bad part was the humidity that would follow that. But we had Jacob and Mindy's daughter, Sydney. She came out with Malia and Emery, and of course, most of us are familiar with them. They are common sights around here when they're visiting Mino. But I was thinking about that just because it was so funny. I told Sister Mindy earlier that I think it was Sunday night, just camp barely begun, and at one point I'm standing around and I saw Emery and I smiled at her, and she looked up at me and she said, "How's Miss Mindy doing?" And I said, "Who?" She said, "Miss Mindy." I said, "Miss Mindy is in Mino?" She said, "Yeah." And I said, "She's doing well." But it was just funny to me that she called her Miss Mindy instead of saying, "How's Mino doing?" or whatever. Maybe she thought I wouldn't know who that was. But there was another incident. We sort of teased Malia and Sydney both that Malia was, in fact, she got an award, most likely to have to go see the camp nurse. And one particular evening, a bench had fallen over or something, and she got her fingers underneath it. And she had mashed her fingers pretty well, and boy, I had her upset. And she was, as we often say, no tired like camp tired. She was very, very tired just toward the end of the week. She falls asleep on a pew, slept through most of supper, but she woke up. I don't know if she didn't get that nap out or what, but she was just unconsolable. And if you've ever been there as a parent, you know what that's like when a child gets to the point where it's like no matter what you do, you can't shush them, you can't threaten them. There's nothing you can do, and that's how she was. And it was, sometimes even as a parent, you just laugh to keep from crying. And Sydney's got her in the kitchen. Everybody's in the mess hall for worship. And as we finish singing the Psalm for lesson, Brett gets up to preach, and you could just, this faint, you can hear Malia in there, and you just hear, woo, you just got to sound almost like a ghost or something. And so I go in there to try to help, find some children's ibuprofen, but Malia's having none of that. And she was just beside herself. So Sydney then takes her to outside, and I told Sydney, I said, "Look, my presence here is obviously not helping. So if anything, I think I'm making her more upset. She didn't even want Mom at that point, but she certainly didn't want Mr. Chab. So I said, "Look, I'm gonna be around the corner if you need me. I'll go sit on the front porch so I can hear the lesson, but if you need something, I'll be there." She says, "Okay." She finally got settled down. Camp nurse came down, took her up to the cabin. But all that just to say, it was a little bit later. It was actually when, after Junior and I talked, and Junior had asked me to go get a few people to come to the baptism. So I was up there talking, and out of the corner of my eye, I saw somebody standing there, and I thought it was just a child playing or whatever. And after a bit of telling this person, that person, we're going to go down here for this baptism, I realized that's Malia, and she's waiting to talk to me. And I looked down, and I said, "I'm sorry, sweetie, did you need me?" And she said, "Yes, sir, I just wanted to tell you thank you for helping me." And I said, "Well, I don't know what I did to help, but I really, really appreciate that." And I talked to Sydney later, and I said, Malia came and talked to me and said, did you tell her to do that? She said, "No." So when we got up to the cabin, once she got settled down and feeling better and worship was over, she said, "I have to go down there and talk to Mr. Chad." And I thought that was really sweet, and that's good raising. So Anyway, we had a good week. And I also want to tell you, I'm excited, but I'm also it's kind of bittersweet because tonight I want to share with you some details, pictures from my trip to Costa Rica back in April when Rachel and I went. I say it's bittersweet just because I know a lot of folks are going to be at camp tonight, but it was just a good time to go ahead and do that, and so I'm going to do that, Lord willing, this evening. You see on your handout we're talking, and Johnny alluded to it just a moment ago, about dads, obviously this being Father's Day, but particularly fathers as point man. It was suggested at our Men's Day, this book by Steve Farrar called Point Man. And that expression, that idea, comes from the military. And I had a lengthy discussion with Brother David Adams, who did, I think, at least a couple of tours, combat tours in Afghanistan. They were combat, they were other things as well, but they dealt with a lot of these things. And some of this has changed. A lot of times when we picture point man, we picture, let me say for my generation, we may picture somebody in Vietnam, infantry. And that certainly still is the case sometimes. But in David's unit, and I thought, talking to him, it really, I think, resonated as far as, and really works well with the illustration that we're looking at here with fathers. But let me share with you just a few things and hopefully help you kind of understand this concept and this idea that we're talking about when we say dad is the point man. You see the very brief definition there, the lead soldier of a patrol on combat operations. I didn't really have room to put it on the handout, but that's from dictionary.com. This is a critical job, though, and talking to David, I won't share all of it because I said we had a lengthy conversation. It was just very, very fascinating to me, but he was telling me point man is still sometimes used in some contexts, but for their units, they tended to use an expression, something like lead truck, because they were in vehicles. And sometimes they're going from one town to the other. They may be going ahead of a unit to make sure everything is secure. They may just be passing through a town and sometimes run into trouble. But there are all these different things they would be doing depending on their orders that day. But they would have a convoy of vehicles. This point man principle is the same, though, with that lead truck. So looking at kind of, you want a more technical definition, point man is the soldier leading a military patrol or formation, taking the most exposed and vulnerable position at the front as it advances through potentially hostile or unsecured territory. But David was telling me, Brother David Adams was telling me, that this lead truck would travel sometimes almost a mile ahead of the convoy if they're on pretty flat terrain. But basically he would be just barely within sight of the rest of the convoy. He is in constant radio contact with the rest of that convoy, and especially the commanding officer. But he's going to communicate anything of note to them. And this is where it really gets interesting because, you don't need me to tell you, I think, this is not a job you want just anybody on. This is a very critical job. And I was, in talking to David, he said sometimes it would rotate around the different guys. And I said, well, surely even in a platoon or a unit of highly trained soldiers, surely there are some that you're kind of like, I don't think I want that guy being point. I don't want him in the lead truck today. And he said, oh, yeah, absolutely. And so it would be up to some of the commanding officers. That was their discretion. They may say, hey, look, we don't want the lives of all these soldiers in this guy's hand. And it may not be that he's a bad soldier or whatever. He just may not be as attentive. You want your best guys on this because this guy in the lead truck, he's looking for anything of note, anything out of place. It might be something as small as a rock close to the road that looks just a little bit out of the ordinary. Or it might be something as obvious and blatant as fresh dirt, fresh sand, wires leading away from the road. David said sometimes you could go down a road, and you would see wires leading away from it, and sometimes just over here. He said the guy just didn't do a very good job of hiding himself, but they had to manually detonate this. Sometimes they would have a cell phone or something like that. They could detonate it wirelessly. But sometimes the manual detonator guy is just, sometimes you could just look over here and see him laying down. He's just waiting for that moment. So you're looking for things like that. Sometimes it would be a taxi or some other vehicle pulled over to the side of the road. The lead truck is going to look, take notice of that. He's going to see, especially, is that vehicle leaning? As in something heavy is in the truck, such as explosives. David said sometimes you would come up on a vehicle, sometimes it'd be a taxi driver. Well, it's a taxi. What do taxis do? They carry people around, but you might come up on a taxi and there's just one lone individual in there. That's a red flag. But he said especially, sometimes he said you would even come up and the lead truck driver, as he's approaching, would communicate back to the other guys that he sees a man, a lone individual in that taxi, 2 hands on the steering wheel, and he's just got this rigid grip. He said, man, that one sends off all kind of red flags. He also said that there were other times the lead truck would approach a city, typically bustling with people, but instead this little city, village, appears strangely empty. Well, that's a red flag. Maybe nothing, but it could be. And again, there are better lead truck guys than others. One guy may come through and see that city pretty empty, and he say, well, it's a holy day. He knows that. He's familiar. Another one may not pick up on that. But a lot of times that's kind of something that makes you take notice. Some experienced lead truck drivers would notice, for instance, a bridge. He mentioned this particularly. One bridge they came up on that a lead truck driver said, hey, I've driven by this bridge I don't know how many times, and there are always anywhere from a dozen to 20 kids out there playing. He drives by this day, he's coming up on that bridge. There's like 1 or 2. Even that, he said, we need to beware. Something's off about that. Approaching towns that they knew to be hostile or reported to be potentially hostile. A lot of times they kind of figured this out. Some of the folks, some of the hostile folks, they would let the lead truck pass through. And sometimes they would try to hit the middle part of the convoy or even the last vehicle, figuring, well, they're going to come back. They're not going to just leave their guy. And so he said a lot of times it got to where if they knew, if they're on a mission and they're not really there to engage, but they're on a mission to get somewhere else, but they know they're coming through somewhere hostile or potentially hostile, they all catch up to the lead truck. And he said, we're going to get through there as quickly as we can. Basically, you're going, he said, as fast as the slowest truck can go. If the slowest truck can only do 40, then the whole convoy is going through at 40 miles an hour. And they're going to try to get through there as quickly as they can, because there are times when you engage and there are times when you don't. Point men, they're critical for getting soldiers home safely. Well, whether it's a point man in an infantry situation, a lead truck in a convoy situation, that job, that person is critical to getting soldiers home safely. And I tell you what, if you're the guy that day and you're going to be the point man, you want to be on top of your game. You want to be noticing anything out of place. You want to be ready to do everything in your power to get those people that you're guiding, that you're leading out front in that sense, to safety. In that situation, and ultimately home safely to their families. That's your number one goal. If you're the guy in that unit or in that convoy, and you're coming up and you're following, you're counting on that point man or that lead truck driver, you don't want him just kind of piddling around. Maybe he's trying to send a text message or something while he's driving, or just shooting the breeze with somebody else in the truck with him, just kind of looking all boy. No, aren't these mountains around here pretty? And he's not paying attention to what's right there where he needs to be looking. You want that guy to be paying attention, doing his job. It is critical. But here's the thing. And I asked David this. I said, I'm going to guess you have some kind of a manual. And for anybody, whether you've been doing this for 100 times or it's your first time, you got a manual and you can look and see what is the proper response to whatever situation, whatever's going on. How do I do this job? He said, yeah. In fact, he was hoping to be able to find it for me. He said it's buried somewhere in some of his stuff, some of his old Army stuff. But anyway, he wasn't able to find that. But he said, yeah, absolutely. There's a book. And so we often say, we're going to do this by the book, boys. We're going to do this by the book. Keep everything by the book. It means you're going to do it in the way that you're supposed to do it. You know what? When it comes to families, dads, fathers, they're the point man. They're out front. And just like if I'm a point man leading a group of soldiers into hostile or potentially hostile territory, and the difference here with families is we know. There's not potentially hostile. We know we're in a war, spiritually speaking. In fact, Steve Farrar's book, Point Man, page 12, he makes this statement. It's not a quote, but paraphrasing what he says there. Satan has two specific strategies in his war on families. Number one is to effectively to alienate and sever a husband's relationship with his wife. If Satan can do that, he's gone a long way in his war on families. Number two, effectively to alienate and sever a father's relationship with his children. If Satan can effectively sever, alienate husband and wife, father and children, for that family at least, it's looking pretty serious. Unless there's some serious help arriving soon, that's for that particular battle, that family, Satan has won. But we got to go by the book, as we say. And Psalm 119:9 says, wherewithal shall a young man cleanse his way? By taking heed thereto according to thy word. Let me paraphrase it just a little bit. Wherewithal shall a father cleanse his way and that of his family that he's leading? By taking heed thereto according to thy word. You know Psalm 119:105. Thy word is a lamp unto my feet, a light unto my path. And God has given us all things that pertain to life and godliness, 2 Peter 1:3. And so dads, we are the point men. But let's do it by the book. We got a much higher chance that we get our families home safely. At some point, children, and even considering wives and children as they get older, they're free moral agents, and they're going to make their own decisions. Just like a point man, he could be leading the troops, and maybe like that lead truck like David was talking about, and he radios back and he says, hey, this situation is, I'm telling you, maybe it's the taxi with the guy and he's just got rigid hands, white knuckle grip on the steering wheel. That thing's, bowed down with the weight in the back. This is very obvious. There's a problem, and the point man may say, hey, we got to do something here. But maybe the commanding officer, maybe the others, they just say, and they keep on driving. Well, they may not end up going home safely, but it's not because the point man didn't do his job by the book. But in Ephesians 6:4, you know the verse. It's very, very familiar to us. I dare say most, if not all of us, know it by heart. Ye fathers, provoke not your children to wrath, but bring them up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. Ephesians 6:4 gives some clear instruction for fathers to guide their children toward God's word, knowing God, and ultimately getting to heaven. But four different points here right from Ephesians 6:4. The first being fairness. Fathers being point men means you need to be fair. So he says, provoke not your children. Now, how might a father provoke his children to wrath? We've looked at this before in an entire sermon, what it means, what it doesn't mean. But just very quickly, a few ways here that fathers might provoke their children to wrath and that we need to be aware of as we seek to be point men who are fair. Fathers sometimes can provoke their children to wrath by overprotection. Two possible ways with this. And the first one is leading from fear. Folks, leading from fear is ineffective. It is a disaster waiting to happen. If we constantly worry about what might happen and we fear what might happen, it ultimately will lead us to just slothfulness, laziness. Because the Proverbs writer talks about that. The lazy man, he'll say, oh, there's a lion out there. And so he just stays at home. But you know what that is? That's just an excuse. He doesn't want to get out there and be productive and work. And so he says, oh, I mean, there are lions out there. I can't go to work. I mean, I would. Just trying to be safe. And sometimes people even say that to this day in spiritual matters, in family matters. Hey, I'm just trying to be safe. Now, don't mistake me. Doesn't mean just say, well, you know, like Chad said, don't want to provoke my children to wrath, so don't want to overprotect them. You want to go do this? Sure, go do it. You want to go do that? Sure, go do it. Doesn't mean you never say no. There's a difference. But we can be so, in fact, the next thing here I've got is for us to remember, a too tight leash, it'll choke you. You know, we may put an animal on a leash to keep them under control, especially if it's maybe a dog or something that we know is not good with strangers. And so we keep that thing on a leash, but if you get it too tight, you know what you're going to do? You're going to choke that dog to death. But if you've got it right, then you have restraint. There's rules, there's authority, there's control, but not so tight that it chokes him to death. So I think we understand that concept. You can't lead out of fear. It just doesn't work, period. But number two way of doing this, it's overprotection, is a failure to allow consequences. This is probably the more common thing that you see as far as provoking children to wrath via overprotection. And a lot of times you don't see the results of this as much until down the road. Proverbs 19:19 says this, a man of great wrath shall suffer punishment. For if thou deliver him, yet thou must do it again. You know what that means? You deliver him, you'd say, well, you know, I know he got in trouble and this is supposed to be the consequence, but I'm going to help him out. Get him out of that. He says, get ready, because you'll have to do it again. And again, and again, and again. There are certain times when when a person, child or adult, needs to suffer the consequences of their actions. And then you find out, hey, maybe I shouldn't do that next time. You go to get some of those cookies Grandma's made, and a wooden spoon comes down and feels like it about breaks a knuckle. That's suffering some consequences. But buddy, next time you walk into Grandma's house and she's got those fresh cookies out, at least you're going to think twice about that, right? But sometimes we have a failure to allow consequences, and sometimes it's with all good intentions, but you deliver this person, the Proverbs writer says, you're going to have to do it again and again and again. Sometimes you got to allow people to suffer the consequences of their actions. Another way fathers provoke children to wrath is favoritism. You know the story with Jacob and Joseph, his favorite son. He made him that coat of many colors. Oh, the brothers were so jealous, couldn't even speak peaceably to him. Doesn't justify what the brothers did, doesn't make that okay. But why was Jacob playing favorites with his children? Nothing good is going to come from that. I think probably he played favorites with his children, at least to some extent, because he learned that from his own father. Remember Isaac and Rebekah? Oh, Isaac, he loved Esau, Jacob's twin brother. And Rebekah, Genesis 25:28 says, she loved Jacob. And then in chapter 27, she tells Jacob, says to him, hey, let's get this birthright for you, favoritism. It doesn't end well, and that's a surefire way to provoke children to wrath. Number 3 here, discouragement. Discouragement is one way that fathers provoke children to wrath. Be careful with this because it's just so easy to do without realizing it. And I've got some examples that are more egregious, I guess, and probably easier to recognize, but sometimes it's more subtle. You know, a father might be inclined to say to a child, "Can't you do anything right? You just don't have what it takes. I don't know if you're ever going to amount to anything." Those are some more obvious, blatant examples, but sometimes it's subtle things, such as comparing a child to others. Well, why can't you be more like your brother? Now, if you'd be more like your sister here, or sometimes people say, well, look at the Jones child down the street here. I mean, that kid's got it together. Why can't you be more like that? But Jesus is the standard, folks. 1 Peter 2:21, for even hereunto were you called, because Christ also suffered for us, leaving us an example that you should follow his steps. 1 Corinthians 11:1, Paul says, be you imitators, followers of me, even as I also am of Christ. Jesus is the standard. I had a preacher friend tell me several years ago, somebody came to do a gospel meeting there, and one of the members walked out and looked at him, and the guy was a tremendous preacher. In fact, he was one of my instructors in preaching school, the guest speaker. But they looked at that local preacher and they said, why can't you preach like that? So that was tremendous. Why can't you preach like that? What an awful, horrible, un-Christ-like thing to say to someone. Not just out of the sheer fact that it's rude, but nobody's going to preach just like anybody else, because everybody's an individual. And that brings us to the next way that fathers can provoke children to wrath, is forgetting that children are just that. They're individuals. They're not carbon copies of dad. And sometimes, as dads, we may want to mold them into that. And especially, it might be that that child is not into the same interest, recreational interest or whatever that I have. It might be, sometimes it's difficulties of dads relating to their little girls, because maybe they have different interests than dad does. But just don't forget they're individuals. They're not going to be carbon copies of dad. Even if they have some of the same interests, they're still not going to be just carbon copies of us. Next, we can say fathers provoke children to wrath by neglect. This sometimes is physical neglect. They fail to provide for them physically, but I would say more often than not, at least for our purposes here, we'll say it that way, we're talking more about a failure, not physical neglect, but a failure to spend time with them, to train them spiritually. That is neglect. In fact, it's the worst kind of neglect. Paul says if somebody doesn't provide for those of his own household, he's denied the faith and is worse than an infidel. We often use that in the physical context, and I think obviously it's there, but don't forget there's a spiritual aspect to that as well. Spend time with them. Train them spiritually. Take interest in their hobbies, in their sports, and things like that. A couple of verses there that are probably at least familiar to us. You may not recognize the references, but a merry heart maketh a cheerful countenance. Proverbs 15:13 says, but by sorrow of the heart the spirit is broken. 17:22 says, a merry heart doeth good like a medicine, but a broken spirit drieth the bones. In other words, have fun. But don't make it all just your idea of fun. There may be something they like that I'm not as into. Well, I need to be able to be willing to spend some time with them in that, not just neglect that. And, well, we're only going to have fun if it's my idea of fun. And I'm going to tell you something. I don't think I'm the only one. That's challenging sometimes, isn't it, dads? Because it may be something that I'm kind of like, this doesn't sound very fun. Dad, let's sit down and play with the dolls. Let's sit down and have a little tea party or whatever. You know, it's like, oh, I am so excited. But if that's something I can do and spend time with my child, why not get excited about that? That's quality time together. Take interest and set the example. Romans 2:21 and 22. Boy, this is a challenge for us sometimes, dads. Paul says there, thou therefore which teachest another, teachest thou not thyself. Thou that preachest a man should not steal, dost thou steal? Thou that sayest a man should not commit adultery, dost thou commit adultery? Thou that abhorrest idols, dost thou commit sacrilege? He says, practice what you preach. Matthew 23, 2 and 3, talking about scribes and Pharisees. Jesus is telling his disciples that they sit in Moses' seat. All therefore whatsoever they bid you observe, that observe and do. They sit in a seat of authority, and so when they tell you to do something that's according to the word, do it. But, he says, do not ye after their works, for they say and do not. Man, people may not know a thing about the Bible or God, but there's one thing the world recognizes very quickly and easily, and we could say the same for children, and that is hypocrisy. When we're, as the saying goes, all talk and no walk. And then another way fathers can provoke children to wrath is to by using bitter words or just being outright cruelty toward them. That might be verbal abuse, might be physical abuse, but it's just meanness. Again, we need to be careful about that because sometimes we might be losing our temper, might just be sometimes we're being sort of sarcastic and maybe we think that's obvious, but it's not always obvious to them. So provoke not your children to wrath. Be fair. If you want to be a point man, a godly point man for your family, be a person of fairness. But next, be a person with your children of fondness. He says, provoke not your children to wrath, but bring them up. That's from a Greek word that means to nourish up to maturity, to nurture. And again, we could give a number of different ways fathers could bring them up in that sense of nurturing and this idea of fondness and nurturing our children. Here are just a few. Listen to them. Respect their feelings. There's a proverb in Proverbs 28:13 that says, that's not the right one. Sorry, I got the wrong one there. It's supposed to be 18:13. 18:13. Is it right on the handout? Okay. I was going to say, I think I may have just had a typo in the PowerPoint. It's Proverbs 18:13. He that answereth a matter before he heareth it, it is folly and shame unto him. Now, sometimes as parents, sometimes as dads, and again, I don't think I'm the only one, maybe it happens a lot when children are, maybe they're getting in trouble about something, getting scolded about something, or maybe they're getting instruction about something. But sometimes it can just be in everyday situations. And they say, well, Dad, listen, and they maybe start trying to tell us their feelings. And I may just cut them off. But you answer a matter before you hear it is folly and shame. I don't always have to say, well, is that how you feel? Because, a child may say, hey, I feel like I should not get any punishment for this. Well, okay then. Carry on. Nope. That's not what we're talking about. My grandmother Dollahite used to tell me how it would make her so furious because she said, Paul, my dad's father, would come home and, there was a lot of times in that generation, they'd say, wait till your father gets home. When I grew up, it wouldn't wait till your father gets home. It was like, I'll take care of this right now. But so she would say, Paul would take Daddy off, and she said, I could hear him, and he'd say, now, Daddy, you may choose to whip me, and I understand that, and I probably deserve that, but before you do, I think we should talk. And she said, oh, I knew every time he said that, we're going to talk, he's getting out of it. And it drove her crazy. And she said he'd talk his way out of that whipping or grounding or whatever it was. Not talking about just no consequences. We've already mentioned that. But listen to them. Respect their feelings. Be aware of that. Now, another way we can bring them up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord is by confessing and asking forgiveness when we're wrong or when we're too harsh. This is Proverbs 28:13. He that covereth his sins shall not prosper, but whoso confesseth and forsaketh them shall have mercy. That applies to a father, parents, just as much as anybody. Look, sometimes we've been wrong. Have you ever just flown off the handle and then you realize later on you just totally were wrong? I mean, I can't remember exactly what it was one time, but I got so upset and just let them have it. I think I kind of let them all have it because nobody confessed to it. And, sometimes something's broken and nobody knows nothing. It wasn't me. That's all I know. Wasn't me. And I'm like, well, here it is. It's broken. Nobody knows anything. Isn't that amazing? But I had just gotten so upset about something and come to find out later, I think it was when Mom got home, she said, oh, yeah, sorry. I dropped that thing and broke it. Oops. But now what do you do? Well, I'm sure y'all had that coming anyways. No, we need to say, you know what, I'm sorry. You were telling me the truth, and I appreciate that, and I'm sorry that I reacted wrongly. And I hope you'll forgive me. And you know what? In the times that I've had to do that, I don't think I've ever had, I know, I've never had once where a child says, well, maybe, I might. They always say, it's okay, Daddy, I love you. But let's be mature enough, man enough, when we mess up, when we're wrong, we're too harsh, to say, I'm sorry, I was wrong, and please forgive me. Another way we can bring him up, nurture them, is listening to our wives' input on each child. Look, there's no doubt she often knows best. Not always, but she often does, and there needs to be input there, and she needs to listen to the husband's input, he needs to listen to hers. Proverbs 12:15 says, the way of a fool is right in his own eyes, but he that hearkeneth unto counsel is wise. So constantly saying, hey, look, I'm the man, I'm gonna decide how we do this. I don't need your input. That's just a fool. But the one that hearkens to counsel is wise. Another way we can nurture them is by being, and this is Farrar's phrase, but I like this, high touch. In other words, give them a hug, pat them on the back. Just ways of physical contact. Being high touch and encouraging them freely. Encouraging them copiously, we might say. Heaviness in the heart of a man maketh it stoop, Proverbs 12:25. But a good word maketh it glad. Be high touch. Be encouraging. Consider their temperaments, we might also say. Some children are going to require a little extra reassurance. Some are good. They all require reassurance. But some are going to require some extra. And so bring them up. Nurture them. Third, we would say firmness and the nurture and admonition of the Lord, particularly looking at that phrase or that word, admonition. To be firm is to be strong, steady, resolute, because children they're going to test the rules, they're going to push against rules and boundaries, and he talks about this in his book, Farrar does, how this is testing whether parents love them enough to hang tough with them, whether they really care about them enough, they're serious enough about those rules and limits. Do they really mean that, or is this just an arbitrary thing? And so they're going to push. But firmness answers yes. I'm serious about this because, especially when it comes to spiritual matters, because God is serious about this. And I do love you enough to hang tough with you, even when you push against those, even when it's not always easy, even when you mess up, and there are consequences, but I'm going to hang tough with you, and I'm not going to bend those rules. Every child needs a firm, that strong, steady, resolute, a firm father's hand guiding them, being their point man. Every child needs that. And we ought to thank God if we've had that in our lives currently or before. You see, discipline it's all about training. It's discipleship. In fact, you can see the similarity in the words. And as Steve Farrar says, that is discipleship is a dad's greatest privilege. Boy, that's a phrase that hit me and continues to when I think about that. Discipleship, a dad's greatest privilege. Because discipline is building the child's moral character. You know about Eli and how he failed to discipline his sons, 1 Samuel 2:13. And God says, I think that's 3:13. I got another typo on my PowerPoint. God says, I've told him I'm going to judge his house forever for the iniquity which he knoweth, because his sons made themselves vile, and he restrained them not. talking about Adonijah, the son of David in 1 Kings 1:6, it says that his father had not displeased him at any time. In other words, he just let him have whatever he wanted. That's not discipleship. Discipleship, discipline, is building a child's moral character. The heart of training is instruction, teaching them to know God, to know His will. Deuteronomy 6 and 7, familiar passage there where, God says through Moses, these words which I command you this day, they'll be in your heart. You'll teach them to your children. Talk of them when you sit in your house, when you walk by the way, when you lie down, when you rise up. All the time, in other words. Training, instruction, teach them to know God. Discipline and instruction, they are the firm side of love, as Steve Farrar says. But here's some general guidelines from Proverbs about a father who is firm. You want to be a father who is firm. That doesn't mean you're just wearing them out all the time. But a father who is firm, he takes the lead. It doesn't mean the mom's not involved. It doesn't mean she has no input. But he is going to take the lead. We're going to have some rules. We're going to set some rules. We're going to set some boundaries, some guidelines. And godly fathers, they're going to be based on the Word of God. He takes the lead. He establishes boundaries. And you know what? He lays out very clear consequences. If you break this rule, if you break a family rule, if you break a rule, a spiritual rule that is, because it's a spiritual rule, it's a family rule, there are going to be some consequences. Here they are, and you need to know that ahead of time. He lays those out. He is also consistent and balanced. This might be the hardest part. And yet I'll tell you this, a lack of consistency and balance, you don't have that, you will confuse and discourage children more than you realize. Because sometimes it's like they do something and dad says, well, all right, I told you, here's the consequences, and he administers that. But another time, and sometimes it'll be because dad maybe is in his easy chair, he doesn't really feel like getting up. Stop doing that. Stop. I told you, stop. And sometimes that leads to an explosion where we then later on find ourselves needing to apologize because and I mean, again, I'm not the only one I know. When I'm honest with myself, what happened in that situation was I was too lazy to get up and be consistent with firm discipline. And balanced, we say, because sometimes you may realize as a father, you know what, this is a bit, it's a bit strict, overly strict. I'm getting that leash to the point of choking, and I need to lighten up. But sometimes his dad will say, boy, you give him an inch, he'll take a mile. Now, if you need to make an adjustment, make the adjustment. Be honest about it. And you know what? You may realize you've been way too loose. Well, too late now. If they are in your house, if they're in your life, it's never too late. Now, they may be out of the house and I can't control to the point like I could a child that's in my house, but I can still say, hey, I should have done better in this, and I just want you to know, here's how it should have been and how it should be. So many different proverbs we could look at. A number of these dealing with discipline. I'll leave you to study those on your own, and I meant to put those in the handout, and I didn't because I knew I wouldn't have time to get to them, but I can give those to you afterward if you just let me know if you want to take a look at those. But so much firmness, nurture and admonition of the Lord. And then kind of wrapping this all up, pulling it all together is fullness, and that is bring them up in the Lord. This is the sphere where it all takes place. Otherwise, it's in vain. You see, a dad may be completely fair with his children and yet not bring them up in the Lord. That could happen. A dad could be highly nurturing, lots of hugs, pats on the back, encouragement, and yet not bring them up in the Lord. A dad could be very balanced, very firm, very resolute in his discipline and his training, and yet not bring them up in the Lord. You know Matthew 16:26, Jesus says, what does a man profit if he gain the whole world and lose his own soul? Can I paraphrase that just a little bit? What is a man profited if he be an otherwise perfect father, but he loses his own child because he failed to bring them up in the Lord? Or what shall a man give in exchange for the soul of his child? Think about it. We got to find balance between firmness and tenderness. That again, that's a great challenge, but we can do it. Proverbs 3:3 says, "Let not mercy and truth forsake thee." And in Psalm 85, verse 10, he says, "Mercy and truth are met together. Righteousness and peace have kissed each other." In other words, mercy, truth. Truth is, here's what's right, here's what's wrong, and you violate that, and well, you're in violation of it. But mercy comes along. God's mercy, God's grace is sending Jesus to die on the cross for sinners. And that's how God tempers that. His grace, His mercy. And so mercy and truth come together. Righteousness and peace have kissed each other. Psalm 86:15 says, "Thou, O Lord, art a God full of compassion and gracious, long-suffering and plenteous in mercy and truth." So balance mercy and truth as fathers, as parents, and understand God will help you with that. He promises He'll do so. Psalm 32:8, "I will instruct thee and teach thee in the way which thou shalt go." Dads, we've got to be the point man for our families. Look, who's going to teach your children about God? Who's going to guide them to safety? Government's not going to do it. I can promise you that. Public school system, private school system for that matter, they're not going to do it. Who's going to guide those children to safety? You imagine the lead truck driver in a convoy and he says, "Well, I'm sure somebody will notice if there's anything out of place." No, that's on him. Dads, be the point man. We got to be alert, observant, decisive, because, sometimes there's a time to engage. 1 Timothy 6:12, fight the good fight of faith. And then there are times when we need to flee. Flee also youthful lusts, but follow righteousness, faith, charity, peace with them that call on the Lord out of a pure heart. 2 Timothy 2:22. We're all leading somewhere. Are we where we need to be spiritually? If you're not a child of God today, I'm happy to extend heaven's invitation. Leroy Dedman pointed this out a few weeks ago, that invitation is always open as long as we're alive and able. It's open where we can come to Jesus. He says, "Come to me and you'll have rest." If we come to Him in simple, trusting faith, surrender our will to His in repentance, confess Him as Lord, and be baptized into Christ, we'll be raised up to walk in newness of life. That invitation is always open, but maybe you realize you're not where you need to be. Maybe as a child of God, you're not where you need to be and need to make changes. Maybe you just need encouragement. If we can help you some way to be any opportunity you have out front and helping lead others to safety, but especially as fathers, let's guide them home. If we can help you in some way, come while we stand and sing to encourage you.